Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2, where we're putting the Syrian Airborne Mechanized platoon through its paces. This is another Soviet-style unit. I'll leave a link to the quick guide to them down below. What makes them unique in Shock Force is their use of the BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle, which is what you get when someone asks you how much firepower you want your IFV to have, and your answer is yes. The platoon does have a choice of RPG-7s or RPG-16s for the dismounts. I went with RPG-16s because they're unique to the Syrian Airborne and the change from the RPG-7s we see all the time, even if this is probably not the best choice. To recap the scenario quickly, there's a reinforced squad of very angry, very competent US Marines in one of 5 possible locations on our map. Our competing platoon's task is to find and destroy them. I rolled up a 2 for our randomly determined entry point this time, so our airborne are starting off on the eastern map edge opposite Objective Bravo. This puts us close to the edge of the uncultivated quadrant of the map. The platoon starts off in a little valley, which is nice because the Objective Bravo hill is the dominant terrain feature around here and it overlooks a lot of the surrounding terrain. It's the closest objective too, so I guess that's the best place to take a look at first. I can actually do this from inside my setup zone, so the sniper team and one of the squad A teams spend a couple of turns observing the summit. They don't spot anything. They are about 450 meters away though. That's a long way to spot someone who doesn't want to be seen, so I send one of the BMP-3s up with the commander sticking out the hatch to see if anyone decides to have a go at him. The Marines were definitely eager to take some pot shots at this kind of range last time. Here, nothing happens. That means Bravo is probably clear. I could go and physically check, but that would take me into the middle of the map near Charlie, where we were with the regular Syrian mech last time. So instead I decide to tackle the objectives in a clockwise direction and head off towards Echo. This allows me to take advantage of some high ground overlooking that objective. Again, there's no sign of the enemy. Closing the distance draws no fire. Eventually I throw the sniper team across an irrigation ditch to investigate, and they reveal that the compound is clear. Consolidating on Echo, I could head up the highway towards Charlie, but after the last run I think I'd prefer to take that particular objective from the other side of the stream if possible. I've got a pretty good view of Delta from my current position at the Echo crossroads. I could set up a base of fire here with 2 of the BMP-3s and use the last one to push some infantry forward for a closer look. So 1st and 2nd squads stay at Echo, while I send 3rd and the sniper team out left. The most direct route to Delta is along the causeway, but there's no cover and nowhere for the vehicles to go if they come under fire, so 3rd's BMP goes out wide to the left into the dead ground of the fields. 3rd and the sniper team dismount at the next berm and head up to peek over the top and eyeball Delta. The sniper team marksman takes a knee, raises his binos, and gets shot in the face. Evidently the Marines are at Delta again. By the end of that turn I have 2 contacts, some kind of team on the roof of building D7, probably a small team, and a confirmed spot in the undergrowth in front of D6. That's great news. 1st and 2nd's BMPs immediately start chucking 100mm HE shells at Delta, covering 3rd's dismounts as they scramble back into cover. That of course means I lose the spots, but I'm happy pummeling the general area for a bit while I figure out how I'm going to conduct my attack. What I really want to do is leverage the firepower on the BMP-3s. I don't have a lot of dismounts. I need them to be mopping up what's left by their vehicles, not taking the lead here. The BMP-3s need to keep their distance and they can't see very well, meaning that they're going to struggle to spot and engage targets on their own. What I need to do is get the dismounts forward to a point where the Marines will engage them and reveal their positions, but not so close that they'll be able to inflict a lot of casualties. Once the enemy positions are identified, I can schwack them at a distance with the BMPs. I don't fancy pushing my dismounts forward down the ditches on either side of the causeway. The right is not necessarily a bad avenue of approach because my infantry will be screened by the auction around Delta, but that kind of defies the point here. I want them to get shot at. So keeping to the left looks best. There's a field next to the river that's screened by a berm, meaning I have a safe area of dead ground in which I can unload the dismounts and manoeuvre the BMPs. The berm is about 250 meters from Delta, well within the Marines' engagement range, but probably not close enough for a decisive firefight. While the dismounts draw fire in some safety, the The BMPs can support them from raised ground further back towards the highway, where the ranges are longer and they're less likely to get hit by any AT weapons. It takes a few turns to get the infantry into position. I left the remaining man from the sniper team to nab the SVD off his wounded buddy, but he gets shot as well, so the sniper team is out of the picture. Despite that, the dismounts get out behind the berm opposite Delta, and the BMPs move off to take up firing positions on what is now my right. This means leaving the dead ground of the field and going around Farm 4. I originally wanted to send all of the BMPs around the backside of the farm, between the buildings and the river, because that way they wouldn't be exposed to Delta. But that whole side of the farm is walled off, and in combat mission the BMPs can't just roll over that kind of obstacle. So I send first BMP around the back to peek over the shoulder of the farm where it can see Delta, but second and third across the front. Second goes past them behind some trees towards another patch of dead ground. The Marines reach out with a s'more, but it falls short. Third's BMP briefly bogs in the field and gets a little delayed as a result. I've got it rushing up onto the berm, then reversing into cover behind the buildings of the farm, so that all three BMPs are well spaced out. This is a terrible idea, and I have no idea why I thought it would go well. Third's BMP catches a s'more while it's farting about in full view of the Marines. Somehow the ammunition doesn't cook off, and just like that I'm down to 2 vehicles. To make matters worse, the dismounts are actually not in a very good position. The berm they're hiding behind has a deceptively convex shape, and they have to get right on top of it, onto the track on top, before they can see over. This means that when the Marines open fire on them, which they do, they're out in the open without so much as some grass to make them harder to spot. Luckily, it seems all those 100mm HE shells have thinned out the closest Marines a bit, and although there are plenty of M203 grenades coming in, they're not that accurate. Within a couple of turns, the spots are flooding in. It looks like the enemy are concentrated down the left side of Delta, where the BMPs can't get line of sight, so I bring them back in. First's BMP takes up a new position on the far left, next to the irrigation ditch, where it can pop up and enfilade the offending edge of Delta. Second's blasts a hole in the wall behind Farm 4, like I should have done in the first place, and takes the safe route back to the dismounts. Fortunately so far, the firefight between the dismounts and the Marines has been pretty indecisive, but it's not going to stay that way. The Syrians aren't really accomplishing anything except revealing enemy positions, and while that is allowing me to put some high explosive on targets, the Marines are slowly dialing in those 40mm grenades. After taking a few casualties, I decide it's time to either go all in or go home. Going home would be boring, so I need to close the distance. I don't think it's worth slogging through the ditch on my left, which pretty much leaves the classic straight up the middle option. That's probably safer than it looks. The field ahead is slightly lower than the Delta compound, so there is some cover, but I can also pop smoke with the BMPs. Thanks to those Soviet-style offensive smoke grenades, they can put out one screen about halfway across the field behind the berm, then follow the infantry up and use their second charge to put another on the causeway itself. This allows the dismounts to close the distance without getting into trouble. Once they get into the causeway ditches, it quickly becomes clear that this side of Delta has had the fight knocked out of it. The last Marine from the original contact outside building D6 is mopped up by 2nd Squad on the right. The small team in D7 is long gone, as is D7 itself. Moving in, 3rd Squad occupies D6, while the platoon HQ lurks behind them, and 2nd goes out wide to open up the angles. They're engaged by the 2nd small team, which opens up from the roof of D9. This position is screened from the BMPs, which I guess is good because it means they're not about to get smored. I am a little bit reluctant to reorientate the BMPs to deal with them though, because line of sight is obviously a two-way street. Meanwhile, the left looks pretty clear. The Marine HQ team was out past D7, and I know they've been neutralised. Plus, 1st's BMP is overlooking that edge of the compound, and it hasn't spotted anything. So I decide to send 1st Squad off to occupy D8 and tackle the small team at close range, with their BMP putting some shells in next to D9 to try and suppress the AT team. The platoon leader and his assault team leg it into the open, only to be cut down in the D7 ruins by a couple of Marines hidden in the undergrowth. That's a pain, and I rapidly stop the other half of 1st Squad, but I can start applying the firepower again. 1st's BMP lays into the newly revealed enemy position, while I grit my teeth and send 2nd's vehicle off to the right to keyhole onto D9 and get on with hitting that small team. Within a few turns, D9 has collapsed under repeated 100mm shell hits. Second keep going wide and get into D2, where they can get a different line of sight onto the Marine positions on the far side of the compound. They don't see any movement. Things have been conspicuously quiet for a little while now. Sending 1B forward to D8 reveals that the Marines who got the rest of their squad are out of action. With nothing going on, I hit the ceasefire button. The Marines are indeed all out of action. That makes for 19 casualties inflicted by the Syrian Airborne Mech at the cost of 1 BMP-3 and 10 men, 1 crewman and 9 dismounts. In percentage terms, that's 33% of the platoon's vehicles and 42% of the dismounts in an attack that took 35 minutes. In points terms, which are entirely arbitrary remember, they scored 696 out of 1,000. That puts them second to last so far, but a clear 100 points ahead of the regular Syrian Mech in BMP-1s. Interestingly, Syrian Airborne Mech have the highest combat mission points cost so far. They're the 6th most expensive of our 17 platoons, but they're almost at the bottom of the pile. That could be the result of how I've handled them. I suspect the Marines got a really big chunk of points for neutralising one of the BMP-3s, and that was due to what we might politely refer to as an unforced error. I don't know why I didn't blast through the back wall of Farm 4 and just avoid crossing the arc of a small team I knew was there, knew was watching, and knew was in range. But the reality is that people will always make bad decisions. The problem is that these Soviet-style 3-vehicle platoons don't have the mass to sustain them. That said, the BMPs were without a doubt the decisive element here. Between them, they accounted for 15 of the 19 Marines, and of those 15, 12 were killed by 1st Squad's BMP, probably while it was enfilading the left edge of Delta. It didn't particularly feel like it at the time, but all those 100mm HE shells were doing work, and by the time the dismounts actually closed with the enemy, I think there were only 5 Marines still in the fight. They could still get their hits in, as the heroic but misguided platoon leader found out, but this was very much an exercise in the find, destroy, repeat cycle that we saw when the tanks came along for the Cold War company challenges. The BMP-3 is the first of the higher-end vehicles we've seen in the Platoon Patrol so far, so it'll be interesting to see if it's setting the trend for other high firepower vehicles like the Bradley and the CV-90. Before anyone thinks I'm singing the BMP-3's praises here though, I don't think they ever actually spotted anything. One of the key giveaways for that is that they only ever used their 100mm guns. The BMP-3s also have a 30mm cannon, which they tend to favour when engaging infantry targets. There was a lot of exploitation here of the pixel tripper gestalt consciousness that the player represents, which wouldn't necessarily work in reality. That said, I do wish the BMP-3s had used the 30mm cannon a little bit more, because it probably would have been much more effective, especially in the enfilade. Obviously, with the BMPs doing most of the work here, there's correspondingly less to say about the dismounts. Their main role was to find targets for the vehicles, which they accomplished because lying around in the open getting shot at is not a high bar. Of the 9 dismount casualties, 2 came from the sniper team, which was simply picked off by the Marines, 3 were lost in the firefight on the berm, and 3 when the platoon HQ was caught in the open. I can't find number 9, but these are all either incidental losses or mistakes on my part rather than any particular weakness in the platoon TOE. They were outcompeted by the Marines at long range, which we would expect because the Marines are better trained and better equipped, and they never really got into a proper firefight inside the compound. That's partially because only one of the 3 contacts lasted more than a few seconds. The lone mopped-up Marine went down instantly, and the airborne platoon HQ got wrecked before it could even fire back. But it's also because the other contact, the one with the small team, was one I basically declined. The Marines got a couple of rockets and some small arms fire off of the 5 remaining men of 2nd Squad while they were out in the open. They missed all their shots, and I hastily declined the engagement by legging it into some dead ground. If I had had more men, I might have stuck around, but that fits into the flavour of the unit. I didn't particularly need the dismounts to do anything except to find things for the BMP-3s to shoot. The TLDR to all this is that the Syrian Airborne Mech Platoon TOE pushed me into a very standoff approach. That makes sense because I had fragile firepower heavy vehicles supported by too few dismounts to really sustain casualties, but it has its drawbacks. It's essentially an exercise in condition setting. We inevitably need to get onto the enemy position to clear it, but to begin with, the enemy force is intact and it's too risky to close the distance. Staying at long range and applying firepower allows us to degrade the enemy and hopefully neutralise critical assets like anti-tank teams to the point that it's safe enough to go forward. The problem is that the further away we are, and the safer we are, the harder it is to tell what effect our fire is having on the enemy. There will always be some more enemy troops, whether they've survived a bombardment or they've remained out of sight and unspotted. In other words, taking this kind of approach, we need to make a judgment call without perfect feedback. If we go forward too early, the risk factor might not have been decreased enough. That translates into casualties and vehicle losses, neither of which this platoon can sustain in any numbers, whilst potentially committing the unit to very difficult tactical situations with limited options. If we go too late, we waste time and ammunition, and may still have to deal with enemy positions, especially if they've been masked from our base of fire, have otherwise remained hidden, or simply haven't been neutralised or suppressed. Think the first day of the Somme. This is all obvious stuff, but in the context of our Platoon Patrol scenario, I think the right time to go is going to vary depending on the unit in question and their levels of firepower, protection and mass. With the Syrian Airborne in this run, we had high firepower, low protection, low mass, leading to the standoff approach. The Uncons had low firepower, low protection, high mass, meaning it was best for them to close quickly. The Dutch light infantry were kind of medium firepower, low protection, higher mass, and that panned out in a kind of hybrid approach. Obviously it's more complicated than this, but this kind of firepower, protection, mass triad might be an interesting lens we can use to think about how different units conduct their attacks. Speaking of different units, we've gone all the way through our 4 groups now, and that means we're back round to Group 1, which has 3 options left: Syrian Republican Guard and BMP-2s, British Armoured Infantry and Warriors, and German Gebirgsjäger in Fuchs APCs, so a spread of capabilities there. Again, which one we're going for is in your hands. I'll leave a link to the poll down below. Do have to say that the Syrian Airborne probably did about as well as I was expecting. I'm a little disappointed that they lost the BMP-3 and it didn't detonate in spectacular fashion, but I suppose you can't have everything. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.